Welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. We are speaking about the future of offshore wind. It is a special episode in co-production with Rhode Island Report of the Boston Globe and, of course, with Rhode Island PBS, as always. My co-host, Brian Amaral, and I are speaking with David Hardy, CEO of the Americas and Group Executive Vice President at Ørsted, one of the world's largest alternative energy companies, as well as one of the largest, most important offshore wind producers in Rhode Island and across America. First and foremost, what is offshore wind?
Yeah, offshore wind is the next major renewable energy growth platform for the world, but specifically for the United States. It's big wind energy, wind turbines that are built offshore, today primarily fixed to the bottom of the sea, but in the future potentially on floating platforms as well. And the first offshore wind farm was built by Ørsted about 31 years ago in 1991, 32 years ago. The first U.S. wind farm was built about a little over 5 years ago here in Rhode Island, the Block Island Wind Farm.
That's great. Thank you.
So, as you know, Rhode Island recently opened up a request for proposals to get a new offshore wind power project. And just recently, Rhode Island Energy announced that it wasn't going to accept move forward with Ørsted and Eversource's proposal. What was your reaction to that decision? Was that disappointing that your proposal didn't get picked?
Yeah, it was very, very disappointing. I mean, we spent a lot of time preparing our proposal. At the time, we didn't know we would be the only bidder. I don't know if your audience knows that, but we ended up being the only bidder. So we saw it as a competitive tender, and we really tried to put our best foot forward, both with a competitive price, but also with a good state economic benefits package. And so we're quite disappointed to hear that they decided not to move forward.
You know, what do you think it overall says? Not just that they decided not to move forward with it, but that you were the only bidder on this. What do you think it says about the challenges of the offshore wind power industry right now, and some of the headwinds that it's facing in some areas?
There's definitely some headwinds. There's some tailwinds as well. So maybe I'll start with a few of the headwinds and end a little more positively. Offshore wind, like I said, we were 30 years behind Europe. They've had a lot of time to build a supply chain, build service capabilities, train people, et cetera. And they've been able to get the price of offshore wind pretty competitive. There's no subsidies, and it's pretty much grid price for them. Their grid price is a little higher than ours because our natural gas price is lower, but pretty reasonable cost of energy for Europe. And this is what prompted the U.S. to step in, these more progressive Northeast states, New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, et cetera. New Jersey, I can't leave anybody out or I'll get beat up by those governors. Maryland, Connecticut, all of them. Virginia, yeah. They saw the price becoming more and more competitive, and so they kicked off these procurement processes. And now the Biden administration likewise saw the benefits of clean energy at what everybody believed would become a competitive price. The challenge, of course, is that we did start a little bit higher because we're starting from behind. We don't have the supply chain. We don't have the workers. But folks thought that the price would come down, and it was coming down. But then we had these big macroeconomic challenges over the last 18 months with much higher interest rates, much higher input costs, price of steel, supply and demand imbalance. We talk about supply chain bottlenecks a lot, and people don't know what that means. But if you have a lot of demand for these very bespoke vessels that install these massive turbines offshore, the supply chain hasn't caught up with that demand, then these vessel operators can charge whatever they want basically to build a project. And so unfortunately, more recently you've seen quite a few challenges with some of the projects where people bid before these macroeconomic challenges of COVID and Ukraine war. And now the math doesn't work anymore because their cost of capital is higher and their input costs are higher. So those are the headwinds. That's some of the challenge. And to be honest, we had to take those headwinds into consideration when we put our latest bid into Rhode Island, and so the price was higher. We think it's a competitive price, but it was probably, by absolute standards, higher. We're hopeful, though, that all this vision that everybody had about building a supply chain, training workers, and getting the economies of scale and getting this industry started will eventually get us back on that low levelized cost of energy reduction path. And we're hopeful also that, things like the infrastructure bill, the IRA can help incentivize the industry to get started. So those are some of the positive things that will help us. And net, I still feel really positive about the industry, but we definitely have some bumpy times right now. So.
Let me ask, obviously we're talking with Rhode Island Report, and we're in Rhode Island, and you guys are, Ørsted's America's headquarters is headquartered here in Rhode Island as well as in Boston, Massachusetts. But when you entered the U.S. market as the first offshore wind company, European company to enter the U.S. market in 2015 with the Block Island project, what was it? You oversee all of Ørsted's renewable portfolio here in Americas. What is it about Rhode Island, however, that made it so appealing and interesting as the first project in Americas for offshore wind?
Well, I think the Block Island wind farm was actually developed by Deepwater Wind, which we acquired. And so the leadership team that made those decisions to start in Block Island, I think I know them, Jeff Grabowski and others, they saw a specific need where the island itself wasn't connected to the grid onshore, and they were bringing diesel out to the island every day and running 5 big diesel generators to power the island. And so if you're going to do a pilot of a small offshore wind farm, the economic benefit of getting off of diesel and also connecting back to the grid, they got internet, high-speed internet access, and they got backfeed power. So when the wind's not blowing, the power now flows back from the mainland. And when the wind is blowing, they actually power more than the island. The electrons flow through that cable back to the mainland. And the Block Island wind farm actually powers mainland Rhode Island. Many people probably don't realize that. But and so it was just a good place to start, and they had support from the state, et cetera. And so it really showed, that Rhode Island could be a leader in this innovative space. So.
Interesting. And then there's another one that you guys are pulling up that should be online by, I think it's 2035, that's off the coast of Newport and Little Compton.
2025.
2025 in just a couple of years.
Yes. So it's called the Revolution Wind project. It's quite a bit larger. The Block Island Wind project is 30 megawatts. So if you don't speak energy, just think 30. And the Revolution is 704 megawatts. So it's significantly larger. And we'll power 400 megawatts in Rhode Island and 300 plus megawatts into Connecticut through the same grid, but the offtake, the procure of power is Connecticut and Rhode Island.
And for that level of energy, how many turbines are we talking about?
I think it's 62.
Okay.
Yeah. And we have been working on the development of this project since the late teens, probably 17, 18, and just got our final environmental impact study from the federal government. So it's the second to last step in getting our federal permit. And we expect to get our record of decision, which is the final federal permit, in the next month or two. And then hopefully thereafter we'll be able to take what's called a final investment decision, a FID, and we'll go to our board, get permission to spend the rest of the money needed to build the project and start construction later this year.
Assuming that happens,
great.
What difference is that going to make in the life of an everyday Rhode Islander?
Well, the total number of households, approximate number of households that wind farm will power is around 350,000 households. So 350,000 households across Connecticut and Rhode Island will now have 100% clean energy. And we can have the discussion about cost again. At the time, people thought that maybe Revolution was a high price option, but if you compare the peak prices that were paid last winter to the long-term levelized price of Revolution Wind, it's actually significantly cheaper, and that's today, and this is a 30 to 35-year asset. So it might actually be really inexpensive to have offshore wind through Revolution. And this is, again, the debate that we need to have with Rhode Island Energy and maybe the Rhode Island regulators about Revolution 2.
Do you think that there is recourse for Revolution 2? Is there a way that project could be revived, do you think?
I think we're exploring all of our options right now. There are some procedural steps. Rhode Island Energy has to make a recommendation to the PUC. We can comment. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
You got Revolution Wind, you got Revolution Wind 2, you have South Fork as well, which is going to bring its power to Long Island. That's currently under construction right now. People in Newport might have seen that big ship come in. How is that going so far? You were telling us a little bit early before we started recording, but going to see some of that work. Tell us a little bit about that. How's that going so far?
I think it's super exciting. This is the first commercial scale project being built in America. We're kind of competing with Vineyard Wind, which is a Massachusetts project built by one of our competitors, but our project's a little smaller than theirs, and so it will for sure be completed before them, and it'll be the first completed commercial scale project in America, and expected to be completed by the end of this year. First power onto the grid this fall. We've got 5 foundations installed so far. We've got our first U.S.-built offshore substation, which is basically like a big transmission system where the power is converted and conditioned. That platform was built down in Texas, and it's sitting actually up in Provport right now, and will be installed in the next weeks or so. We've got the foundation for that already installed. And then we've got components coming over to our port in New London, Connecticut, where they're doing pre-assembly there of towers and nacelles and blades are on their way. So this is like real time. I joked today with my team that can't say the rubber meets the road, but I can say the bow meets the water. This is happening as we speak. So I think it's just tremendously exciting to see these milestones happening. And like I said, we got our record of decision on our New Jersey project, Ocean Wind 1. We haven't talked about that yet, but that's the largest project in America. And we expect to take FID on that and start onshore construction this year. And we've got a second New York project called Sunrise Wind, which we also expect to take to get our final permit late this year, early next year, and take a final investment decision there. So we will likely have 4 projects in construction at the same time, maybe 3 if we finish up South Fork quickly.
In terms of that, so I mean, obviously, everyone recently, especially, is talking about climate change. The Paris Agreement, which most people should be familiar with, but 195 members are signatories to it. We rejoined as America. Biden rejoined in 2021, and it basically anticipates by 2030 reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52%, our carbon outputs versus 2005 levels. There are many, even within the Ørsted portfolio of clean energy solutions, opportunities to do better. What is the role specifically of offshore wind, and why is it such a powerful or least powerful player within the portfolio of clean energy that gets us to those targets?
Yeah, maybe a little context first. So we didn't actually talk about this yet, but I run the Americas for Ørsted. We are building onshore solar projects, onshore wind projects. We're actually building a solar plus storage project in Arizona that's the second largest commercial scale battery in the world. We have a green fuels business as well, where we're building green methanol to power ships and other things. But offshore wind is our core kind of signatory technology and brand. Like I said, we built the world's first offshore wind farm. We've been building them for over 30 years, and we have by far the world's largest market share. What's unique about, I think all of that stuff is important. That's why I brought it up. So we need all of it in order to achieve these climate goals. But offshore wind is particularly interesting. If you look at our demographics of our country, you've got highly densely populated cities along both coasts, and even the Gulf Coast is fairly highly populated. Houston, second largest city in America, I think now. And so you can build a bunch of solar out in Arizona or wind in Kansas, but there's not as many users of that power in certain parts of the country. And so then you would have to have massive, expensive transmission lines with lots of losses to get the power out. But with offshore wind, you can build the generating asset close to the load. And we have actually some fundamental things that make offshore wind attractive, especially in the northeast and mid-Atlantic part of the U.S. We have relatively shallow waters pretty far off. So it's called a shallow continental shelf that goes pretty far offshore. So you create a lot of seabed that you can build offshore wind on. And we have high wind speeds. And people don't probably realize, but power generation is a cubed function of wind speed. So if you double the wind speed, you 8 times the power generation. It's just the way the physics work. And so when you have high wind speeds, you can have pretty efficient power generation. And so offshore wind becomes a critical tool in the tool belt for America to achieve its climate ambitions, and especially for these eastern seaboard cities in the near term, and eventually on the west, the water's a lot deeper there, so they'll have different technology for floating foundations. But California, high population density, offshore wind will be important for them as well.
So obviously commercial fishing interests have raised concerns about it. Shoreline property owners have raised concerns about it. How do you counter people's concerns about it? What's the message to primarily the commercial fishermen who worry about how it's going to affect their way of life? In Rhode Island, there have been some conflicts over that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big challenges we have is just generic fear of the unknown and disinformation and sometimes funding by people who want to keep the status quo, oil and gas companies, for example. We're really committed to coexistence. So we really we have a large, what we call a marine affairs organization in-house, where we're talking to the fishing community and other marine ocean users we've had literally hundreds and hundreds of meetings. We've set up funds to help compensate for gear loss. We're very data driven, so we've done lots of analysis about how will fisher persons be impacted by these wind farms. We've had very specific layouts. We have a 1 nautical mile by 1 nautical mile layout so that fishing entities and others can navigate through the wind farms. And so we really just believe in coexistence, and we're really trying to help the fishermen understand that this isn't going to completely change their way of life. Visual impact's a little harder because it's kind of eyes in the beauty of the beholder. Last week I was in the UK. I did 2 days of training so that I could go offshore and flew into the Hornsea 2 project off the east coast of the UK. It's the largest wind farm in the world. Flew offshore, and I saw literally hundreds of wind turbines out there. And I sometimes wish I could take these people with me, because to me it was amazing to see. And it wasn't, a negative view shed from my perspective. But the truth is that these projects are pretty far offshore. You're not going to see them most of the time. On a hazy day like today, you won't see them at all. And even on a clear day, they're going to be an inch or two tall on the horizon, pretty far offshore. So they're not like big, giant, looming, wind turbines that are sitting right at 100 yards off your beach or something.
Do you think they're making any difference? Any of the opponents? There was recently a commercial campaign that was announced to counter some of the stuff about whales, about some of the opposition. Do you think the opposition is making it harder to get these projects done?
Like I said, I think if you trace the funding of some of these campaigns, you'll see that it's typically being funded by oil and gas interests, which is disappointing. But it's our job too to educate people and make sure that they understand the reality, and that they don't get disinformation about visuals or whale strandings or other negative misinformation that's shared out there. So.
As we think about wrapping up, because these are pretty quick conversations, one of the things that I think is interesting, you mentioned about, obviously in Europe and Denmark specifically, there's a much longer history. The benefits to the local economies, there are obviously drawbacks and barriers, but what are some of the benefits that you see that you guys are bringing to the state of Rhode Island and beyond now as you expand?
Yeah, if I look across Rhode Island, just a quick, because I don't think we talked about this, but we've got 100 workers or so here in Providence that are working on our engineering, procurement, construction, marine affairs, permitting, development, those types of jobs, white-collar jobs. We've got in Quonset, we've got our operation and maintenance hub there. That's where the helicopter, we will have 5 what's called crew transport vessels, where we'll put techs on the vessels to go out and service all of these wind farms, not just the Rhode Island ones, but the New York ones as well. We'll have a hub there. We've built the Provport, what's called secondary steel manufacturing facility. Those are union workers that built that facility and that are building the components there. They're part of the foundation of the wind farm. We've built these 5 boats in Rhode Island, and we expect to build more. And so we're kind of have quite a bit of impact on the state of Rhode Island. So I guess one of the major benefits, of course, is the economic impact of all this, the job creation that comes from this. And so you've got these you've got a mix of white collar and blue collar jobs, union jobs, non-union jobs, but they're all pretty high paying jobs. If you're a wind turbine technician, you don't have to have a degree. It's with overtime. It's probably a pretty good job compared to maybe working in a warehouse or something. And so we train people. We hired our first 9 technicians like 18 months before they were first going to have to go offshore, and we sent them to Texas to work onshore, and we sent them to the UK to work offshore. But these are folks now that'll have a 30-year job if they want it, high-paying job working in the offshore wind industry. So.
Last question is always, where do you see, you also spent 8 years as a Navy veteran in various positions in submarines. You've spent a lot of time around the ocean. You've been in renewables and offshore wind most of your career. What do you see as the future, and what's your greatest hope for the long-term future of offshore wind?
Look, I'm doing this job because I believe in what we're trying to do, not least in trying to preserve get the benefits of the environmental, rising temperature. And there's a lot of things that have happened just recently here in New England that we can point to that show that this is a challenge that we need to overcome. But I also get quite motivated to see the job creations, and we're doing a lot to kind of work with, the just transition and environmental justice communities and create jobs. In our union agreements, we have high standards for bringing in women and people from diverse backgrounds. And so I think it's a pretty unique role to create something good for the world and help us transition to the next phase of the energy transition, but also to change people's lives actually and make a difference for people. And I've talked to people who've come up to me already, even people who worked on the Block Island wind farm, and said that Block Island wind farm allowed me to buy my first home. There was a union painter that did a lot of work on that project. And I can imagine that there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of those types of stories that we can have an impact on. So maybe for me, the future is a lot of offshore wind, a domestic supply chain, trained workforce, and just a real significant difference in the way we generate power along the East Coast of the U.S. in the next 10, 15 years. So,
thanks very much.
Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thank you for joining us on this week's special edition of Future of XYZ in co-production with Rhode Island Report from the Boston Globe, and as always, Rhode Island PBS. We thank David Hardy and Ørsted for joining us for this special edition. If you didn't know, you can find Future of XYZ anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. You can also watch ripbs.org/XYZ. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Future of XYZ, and feel free to visit future-of.xyz if you want to nominate yourself or anyone else as a guest. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review.